Exactly.
Okay, by my clock, it's 6 o'clock, and I know we'll have some other people join us along the way as well. Yes. Okay. Yes. Okay. Very, very good. We're going to let other people join us as we get going here. And let me just give a couple of instructions for how we're going to handle this tonight. Mark is going to make some opening comments, and then I've got a set of questions that I'm going to engage him in conversation with. But I want you also to have the opportunity to ask questions. And the way you do that on the Zoom webinar is through the Q&A option. So if you go down, most of the time it's down, but some of you it may be up on your screen. You'll see a Q&A option, and you can type in your questions there, and I will monitor them, and we'll sort of put them in as we have opportunity along the way. So just don't do it through chat, do it through the Q&A option on that. And our numbers are still growing. And yeah, Larry, yeah, this is Mark and Mark tonight. It's yeah, double
Mark and Mark show.
Yeah. Reminds me of a bad old joke. I won't go into that. Very good. Okay, well, it's our pleasure on behalf of Baptist News Global to welcome to our conversation that matters tonight, Mark Galli. And just a little explanation, Mark was supposed to be our guest in Atlanta in June at our annual dinner during the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship General Assembly. But due to COVID-19, that didn't happen. And so we rescheduled eventually and decided to use this format as well. And we're so glad that each of you can join us for this. Mark is best known for being the most recent editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. And he recently retired from that role and is doing work that hopefully he'll tell us about along the way. Fascinating life story, even in the present moment. And we're going to talk about all of those things. Mark, for your benefit, our audience here tonight is a lot of Baptists and some other folks as well, all probably on the non-fundamentalist side of the Baptist world, mostly, and that's our core audience. I like to talk about progressive Baptists in our adjacent communities, and that's sort of the network that we live in, which is right up against a lot of the folks that you spent your life with as well. And I'm eager to hear all about that. So without any further ado, I'm going to shut up and we're going to hear from Mark, and then we'll begin some conversation after that. Mark?
All right, good. Well, it's good to be with you. I'm honored that you'd ask me to address some comments to start us off. And obviously I'm open to questions afterwards. What I want to talk about tonight, fortunately, Mark gave me a wide venue to choose from. And the thing that occurred to me is I want to talk about the current state of evangelicalism. And I have a proposal, and I'm going to just kind of talk about that for a little bit. And I really welcome questions, disagreement, good, bad, and ugly. Well, maybe not ugly, but good and bad. That would be great. So I'm gonna be using a teleprompter thing on my phone here, so we'll see how that works. I practiced with it; it should work fine. But I wanted to prepare my remarks because I'm a writer first and foremost, and a speaker second. So I wanted to say what I wanted to say the way I wanted to say it. So I'll be using a manuscript. As editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, I often argued that evangelicalism is not disappearing, and that the term evangelical, while controversial and misunderstood in some quarters, was still the best term to describe the movement. However, after leaving my editorial post, as well as moving my primary religious allegiance to Roman Catholicism, I actually think I have a better understanding of evangelicalism. It's like painting a landscape. When you're up close with brush in hand and eyes close to the canvas, you can see some things better, But when you put down the brush and step back a few feet, and especially as you try to view the painting as someone who's seeing it for the first time, well, you gain a larger perspective that you couldn't appreciate when your nose was on the top of your work. That analogy describes the sense I've had over the last few months since I retired. And I think actually my Catholicism has helped me see evangelicalism more clearly, enough to suggest, if I can do so as a Catholic now, uh, maybe a way forward for the movement. Now, I make this suggestion not as someone who has left evangelicalism with a sour taste in my mouth, far from it. Evangelical faith has shaped me in so many positive ways, it's hard to know where to begin. Well, actually, I actually know where to begin now that I think about it. Soon after my mother's conversion, my brother, my cousin, and I were dragged to church with her, the Evangelical Free Church in Felton, California. We were not talking church light here. We're talking Sunday morning, Sunday evening worship, as well as Wednesday evening prayer meetings, and of course, Sunday included Sunday school. During one class, the teacher read a passage in which Jesus had commanded the disciples to do something. The particular passage and the particular command, I don't remember to this day. I do remember the teacher asking the class of restless junior high kids, why should we do what Jesus tells us to do in this passage? Various answers came forth, all of which amounted to one version of pragmatism or another. It would be good for us, it would be good for others, and so forth. And the teacher kept shaking his head, saying those things may be true, but those are not the reason we should obey this command. When we finally admitted we were stumped, the teacher said, well, we obey this command because it was given by Jesus. Now, even at age 13, I marveled at the simple and profound wisdom of this answer. And for reasons that are too mysterious and complex to fathom, this has become an unshakable conviction for me ever since. We obey the teachings of Jesus and of Scripture in general because of their divine origin. Now, today, of course, I recognize how difficult it is sometimes to hear the voice of the Lord in Scripture and how varied our interpretations can be of what that voice is saying. But I've never been able to shake the conviction that the Bible is the Word of God and Jesus the focal point of Scripture, and naturally the Word of God in another sense. Such is one of the many gifts evangelical religion has bestowed upon me. And despite being a journalist of evangelical faith at Christianity Today, and thus seeing time and again the seamier side of the movement, I nonetheless have continued to admire the evangelical faith. Just one example of hundreds I could give. Today, we take it for granted that Christianity is a worldwide religion. But that would have been laughable in 1800 when Christianity was more or less a European religion. Then came the 19th century missionary movement in which evangelicals, mostly evangelicals, worked feverishly to take the gospel to the four corners of the earth. And yes, they made mistakes and sometimes confused Christianity with Western culture. But overall, more people in more continents know Christ more personally because of these missionaries and their sons and daughters in the faith. So when I talk about evangelicals today, I often use the first person plural, we evangelicals, because I still consider myself an evangelical in my personal relationship to Jesus, my belief in the authority of Scripture, and in the need to spread the gospel. I am an evangelical Catholic and still proud to be associated with the history and legacy of the movement, which is mostly Protestant, I grant. And yet, I have to admit that the evangelicalism that transformed the world is for all practical purposes dying, if not already dead, in my view. The symbol of that was the passing of Billy Graham, who even in old age managed to preach now and then, calling men and women of all ages and many cultures to come into a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. He was also the glue that held evangelicalism together for so many decades. And unfortunately, the symbol of what evangelicalism has become is epitomized by his son, Franklin. Franklin stands for evangelicals on both the right and the left who believe that politics is an essential work of evangelical faith. It started with the right, on the left with Jim Wallace, on the right with Jerry Falwell, each of whom have had their disciples and their successors. Today, Too many evangelicals on the right think to be truly evangelical is to be politically conservative. And many on the left believe that to be truly evangelical is to be politically liberal. In this battle, the conservatives have clearly won, as white evangelicals anyway have voted for the Republican presidential candidate by 67 to 81% in the last many elections. Conservative evangelical leaders talk about abortion or Israel or religious freedom and other topics. But when everyday evangelicals were polled just before the 2016 election, and this poll was published in Christianity Today, they said that the economy was by far and away the most important issue to them. They believed, as they have traditionally, that the Republican candidate could improve job prospects and economic security better than the Democratic candidate. Now, the identification of evangelicals with conservative politics is in some sense the doing of the mainstream media, who tend to make everything political. They assume in their reporting and polling that the most important thing about evangelicals is their politics. A more serious problem is that evangelicals have begun both on the left and the right, have begun to believe this themselves, as they find it harder and harder to imagine that an evangelical from another party can be a real Christian. We've also bought into this in another way. For a few decades now, we've come to believe that if we're not engaged in social justice or cultural change, well, we're no longer relevant. As a result, we've started to let the agenda of the world determine the agenda of the church, and we've sidelined evangelism and church renewal as a result. I saw this transformation first at Christianity Today in the hiring process. Starting in the 1990s, candidate after candidate said the one thing they were most interested in was not evangelism or spiritual renewal, but they wanted to bring cultural analysis to bear in CT. And when we had brainstorming sessions on the staff for what to cover in CT, for every 10 ideas about reporting on this or that social justice ministry, there might be one that argued for an article on evangelistic outreach. It was clear to me at that point that evangelism was just not interesting to the staff anymore. Another troubling sign is our efforts to put evangelicalism in the service of politics. We saw this most disturbingly when an Evangelicals for Trump rally was held in January of this year. In describing themselves in that way, they had become just another political interest group, taking the great name evangelical with all its theological and doctrinal and gospel history and meaning, and putting it in the service of a political candidate. And then what's really troubling to me is that instead of decrying this co-opting of the term evangelical for political gain, the evangelical left has only mirrored this tragic move when they recently formed a group called Evangelicals for Joe Biden. This, to me, is the clearest sign that we have forgotten our first love. Now, by this, I mean two things. The first is something I spoke about in my most recent book, When Did We Start Forgetting God? In that book, I argue that we've become less interested in a deep personal relationship with God for ourselves and others, and more interested in doing lots of good things in his name. The second is our loss of interest in evangelism and church renewal. In fact, I'm going to go so far as to say that our fascination with social amelioration and political activism has watered down the evangelical faith to the point that it looks little different than mainline Christianity. We've forgotten that the genius of evangelical faith was its singular focus, spiritual renewal. You must be born again was preached to individuals and to whole churches and denominations, from George Whitefield to John Wesley, to Charles Finney, to Dwight Moody, to Billy Graham. It was preached in the first and second Great Awakenings. It was preached by the circuit riders and at local Baptist revivals every year or many times a year. The focus was simple and clear. You must be born again and enjoy a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, who died for the forgiveness of your sins and the promise of eternal life with him. The hymns of the movement drove this home. From he lives, Christ Jesus lives today. He walks with me and talks with me along life's narrow way. To him's in the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. Now, let me be clear, or maybe a little confusing at this point. I absolutely believe that Christians should be involved in the public square. To love our neighbors, we must work for their well-being and for justice in our political and social commitments. Christians should not run away from culture, but dash right into the middle of it. I see that the lighting's going to go crazy. Sorry about that. Christians should not run away from culture, but dash right in the middle of it and do whatever it takes to show forth the righteousness of God. And they should do it as Baptists, as Presbyterians, as Lutherans, as Evangelical Free, and so on and so forth. They should do that in church structures that require them to work together, that can hold them accountable, that can help them speak from platforms that have historical and doctrinal integrity, in church structures that strive to live out the whole counsel of God. And in these denominations and in these church structures, one prays that there will be a particular group with a particular passion to win the lost for Christ, to bring ongoing spiritual renewal to their churches. That's their passion. That's their mission. That's their calling. They are, if you will, not unlike a Catholic order, like the Franciscans or the Dominicans or the Carmelites or the Catholic social worker movement. The Franciscans are known for their poverty, the Dominicans for preaching and teaching, the Carmelites for intimate prayer, Catholic workers for social justice. And while each of these has been modified over the years to embrace other concerns, at their heart and in their history, they are known for one thing, and that one thing is a great blessing to the entire church and to the world, for that matter. The mistake of evangelicals in our generation is that we want to be all things to all people and do everything that a denomination is called to do. Discipleship, social outreach, encouraging the arts, neighborhood food closets, homeless shelters, tutoring programs, prayer, worship, and on it goes, as well as evangelism and spiritual renewal. As a result, evangelicals today no longer have a laser focus on evangelism and spiritual renewal. The current people called evangelicals have become nothing more than a group that have a common history, but have lost the vision that explains so much of their influence in previous generations. As a result, I believe they will fade away, as will the very term. We've seen a recent sign of that. The group Evangelicals for Social Justice, founded by Ron Sider, has just renamed itself as Christians for Social Justice. That strikes me as not only an appropriate name change, given my argument above, but also a sign of things to come for all groups who currently identify as evangelicals. Now, that being said, I don't believe that what evangelicalism has historically stood for will ever die. In every generation, the Lord raises up some Christians to whom he gives the charism of evangelism and spiritual renewal. What they will be called in the future, I don't know. But if church history is any teacher, and if the Lord is one on whose words we can depend, the gospel of the forgiveness of sins and spiritual renewal will continue to be preached and spread to the four corners of the world, and it will be carried on by men and women who in previous times were called Waldensians, Lollards, Hussites, Pietists, New Light, and most recently, evangelicals. Thank you.
Wow, what a fascinating challenge. Let me get myself back on the screen here.
Yeah, let me move to get out of the light too.
Yeah. I've got to, okay. Oh, sorry, my skills are draining here. I've got to make you, I just did the wrong, pardon me, everyone, with my ineptitude on this. I'm trying to make Mark, not that Mark.
Make me smaller.
Can you see me now?
I can see you. You're on the top of the screen though. I'm in the main screen.
Okay.
I'm looking at myself.
You can see me. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that beautiful challenge, and what an interesting idea that you put forward. Um, One of the most challenging things I heard out of that was this notion that evangelicalism became like a denomination, even though I was raised believing that it was not. We had denominations that were evangelical, right, and doing that work.
Yeah.
But this homogeneity, I guess, sort of led to this, and we're all going to do these things. So even non-denominational churches, for example, sort of fell into this. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, I think I saw that transition when I was at Christianity Today. I can't recall the specific percentages, but when I first got there, there was a large number of people who subscribed to Christianity Today or Leadership Magazine, where I first was working. It was like 25 or 30% Presbyterians. There was 25 or 30% Baptists. There were a bunch of other denominations. And then people that were non-denominational was a fairly small slice of the whole pie. By the time I left, that non-denominational part had grown quite dramatically, so that people were not evangelical Presbyterians or evangelical Baptists. They were now just evangelicals. And I think that's, and they began to identify more with that label than they did their denominational background, especially if they didn't have one. And that's when a lot of confusion began. I mean, I was a Presbyterian for a while, and I was an Anglican for a while, and I understood myself as an evangelical Presbyterian, one of whose jobs was to help bring spiritual renewal to the Presbyterian Church. We were a renewal movement. But a lot of what's happened is, the other thing that's happened is evangelicals have split from those mainline denominations because of various political or ethical and theological reasons. And so they now identify more themselves as an evangelical denomination, or they identify more as evangelicals than they do with their particular heritage. And that just, to me, led to a lot of confusion about what they should do and not do. And what I'm suggesting is that they're confusing the call of what it means to be a Christian or a member of a denomination, which is very diverse, and what the unique thing evangelicals as such have to bring to the table.
So there's a related question that's been asked on this. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you there.
No, that's fine.
I'd be good at a vice presidential debate if I did that.
Exactly.
When did the term evangelical enter into common usage, and where did it come from?
Well, that's a good question, because for the longest time, most people, if you put a microphone in their face or pollster asked them what they were, they wouldn't know what evangelical meant. It was mostly a term used by scholars of this group of people. But slowly but surely, pollsters began to use it as a summary term for people who describe themselves as born again, and other language used by evangelicals to talk about their spiritual experience of being born again. Most of the time now, they still don't ask the question, are you an evangelical? They ask questions about, do you identify as born again? Do you believe in the authority of Scripture? And those sort of things. So it really is a term in some regard that is used by leaders of the movement and by scholars. I think, you'd have to talk to a pollster about that, but I still think the average person on the street might not necessarily identify themselves with the word evangelical, even though they hold evangelical beliefs, practices, and all those things.
So it really is a 20th century phenomenon, as I understand it.
Yeah, a late 20th century for that matter.
Right.
Although when Billy Graham broke away from fundamentalism, they were calling the movement neo-evangelicalism at the time. There you go.
Uh, our friend and B&G columnist David Gushee has a new book out called After Evangelicalism that's sort of telling, what comes next in this movement. And I do recommend that to everyone as well. Jumping to another question that's sort of back to your talking about Catholic orders and so forth. The question is, what about the Jesuits? You didn't mention the Jesuits in that. What would the comparison be in the larger church for the Jesuits?
Yeah. The Jesuits have a reputation for being the kind of the intellectuals of Roman Catholicism. Also people who tend to push the intellectual boundaries of the church. So that's kind of what they're known for. So you could go on to there's many different orders. Some are the Carthusians are into private hermit, the life of a hermit. It's kind of a contradiction, but it's a life of a hermit in the context of a community where most of the week they live by themselves, they pray by themselves, and then once a week they gather for worship, or maybe even once a day they gather for worship. But most of the day is spent privately in prayer and scripture reading, and that's what they're known for. That's the gift they bring to the church. That prayer. I mean, there are orders who spend all their time praying, and the practical American side of me says, well, what a waste of time. But the Christian part of me says, well, yeah, there ought to be some Christians out there and they ought to be doing nothing but praying for us because the rest of us are pretty bad Christians.
Someone needs to, right?
Yeah.
So you called yourself an evangelical Catholic in a sense. I don't know if you said those exact words.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Are there any other evangelical Catholics besides you?
Oh, yeah. In fact, the previous president of the Evangelical Society, Theological Society, Frank Beckwith, he would describe himself as an evangelical Catholic. But even in the Catholic Church, there is a huge emphasis on evangelization right now. And there are many people, I don't know that they may or may not want to call themselves that, but when you listen to them preach and teach and talk about what they're trying to accomplish, you just think, my gosh, these people are evangelicals. They don't even know it.
Well, that's been my experience too, right? And with Catholics, Episcopalians, with all different forms of church that being raised Baptist and Southern Baptist at that, I was sort of inculcated from an early age that not all other Christian groups were evangelistic like us, right?
Yeah. But that's a big emphasis in Catholicism now, just a huge push on evangelization. Now, part of that is certainly, organizational. Catholics are losing. For every evangelical who becomes a Catholic, 5 or 6 Catholics become evangelical. And then many are leaving the church. The church is, if it wasn't for the Hispanic immigration influx in America, the numbers really would be suffering. Most observers that I tend to agree with tend to think that's probably a healthy weaning out of just nominal Catholics. And most generous-hearted Catholics, if someone leaves the Catholic Church and gets their spiritual life energized by becoming a Pentecostal or an evangelical, they say, God bless them. So there's a lot more fluidity. In fact, one of the surprising things about my conversion is that the number of evangelicals who wrote me on Twitter or wrote me emails just saying how happy they were for me. They wouldn't necessarily make the move themselves.
Right.
There's certainly a different era when you have most of my evangelical friends were blessing me and saying, that's great. Yeah.
So you have a unique perspective, I think, to answer the next question that I had in mind, and that is, what hope do you see for Christian unity? It just, for all of my life, it seemed like the church has been so fragmented in its identity. And we know that Jesus prayed that we would be one. And that seems to me often to be an unattainable goal.
Yeah. Well, I will say that was one of the main reasons one of the larger reasons I was attracted to Catholicism. I did feel the need that for some I think the Catholic Church has moved quite a bit, and so has the Protestant Church. And in a lot of ways, I don't know that there is a really concrete, hardcore theological reason for us to be apart, but it is just very difficult for us to get together because neither side is willing to give up anything. My own view is that the Catholic Church does have the historical right to call itself, I don't know, the original church, the true church, because of its historical precedent, both in orthodoxy. And I thought I could either work for unity on the outside as a Protestant trying to get us together, or I could just give up a lot of my, in a sense, intellectual theological independence at one level and just join the church and be one with it. I do think Protestantism is, at this point, it's catastrophically divisive. I'm not saying that in a way to say that Catholics don't have divisions or don't have arguments. That would be silly. But I mean, when I started at CT, I remember reading an article that there were 20,000 Protestant denominations in the world. You know, the latest numbers are 30 to 36,000. It just seems to be growing exponentially. And a lot of it has to do with, I mean, when you talk to Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists, and you get down to talking about what they believe and why they believe it, there's just not that much differences anymore. The only thing is Methodists don't want to give up their bishops. Presbyterians don't want to submit to a bishop. It's about order. It's about polity.
Yeah, well said.
So I don't know. I'm not sure what to do with that. Now, the other thing I think about is this. I do think the Catholics and the Orthodox are making strides to come together in some way. So they broke officially in 1054. It's 2020. Maybe by 2054, they will have accomplished that. So it's 1,000 years after that split. 500 years ago, 560 or so years ago, the Protestant movement began. It might take another 560 years for that to be healed.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm a hopeful person, but I'm also a patient person.
Well said. And that's an interesting take. I often, folks who know me will know, I often quote that line, that section from Phyllis Tickle's book, The Great Emergence, about every 500 years, the church has a rummage sale. Some big thing happens. And we're at that scene again, sort of right now, 500 years after the Reformation. But I had never thought about it in putting things back together, only about restructuring.
Yeah. So yeah, I may be overly optimistic about that, but that's what I'm seeing. Because I see so much progress on the Orthodox front, and I do see so much generosity among leading Catholics about Protestants in general. There's always a hardcore right in every movement, whether it be evangelical or Catholic, that just spurns the rest of the Christian denominations. But at their heart, they're very generous toward. I mean, the priest, the parish I go to, the priest, he quotes C.S. Lewis as much as he quotes Catholic authors. So,
wow. So, what are the other areas that sort of combines a lot of what you're talking about? That is a unity place between a lot of evangelicals and Catholics is right to life issues and pro-life issues. And the Pope this week, I've not read it yet, but my understanding is Pope Francis come out with an encyclical that, among other things, speaks emphatically against capital punishment.
Yes.
And I think my observation is that Catholics, more than evangelicals, have been able to embrace what I would call a consistent life ethic, to be cradle to grave life ethic that evangelicals don't have. How would you compare and contrast that with your experience with a foot in both worlds when talking about pro-life issues?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that has attracted me to Catholicism is its, social justice theology. It's very mature. It's almost 200 years old now in terms of when the popes first began to initiate encyclicals to help Catholics think about what it means to be Catholic in the public sphere. And It's very rich, it's very thick, and it is driven, especially in the last few decades, by this notion of respect for life from the beginning to the very end. And this comes up quite often. I remember this is just a really important issue to Catholics. I was at my parish, and I can't remember the occasion, but there was something about either an abortion issue, a pro-life issue got passed in Illinois, or an abortion issue got defeated, or something like that. And when the priest talked about it during the service, the congregation broke out in applause. I was just visiting a church here in Denver that I actually thought was pushing the envelope a little too hard. Basically, the priest got up and told people to vote, that they should not vote. The Catholic teaching prohibits them from voting for a candidate that is pro-choice, which a lot of Catholic priests and bishops are saying. Other Catholics disagree with that because they think the pro-life issue is bigger than. They still agree that abortion is a huge problem, but nobody's denying that. But they also see the capital punishment, food for the poor, for the hungry, how we treat immigrants. Those are also pro-life issues as well. So, and they actually said, if you want to pick up signs for this proposition on the ballot, they're available at the back. It was very political. Something you'd see in a conservative Baptist church when it comes to Trump, Trump or other things.
Right.
So I felt a little uncomfortable with that, but it was for pro-life, so I let it go. You join a new church, you're not going to agree with everything that goes on.
Right. It is a fascinating thing, because certainly in the evangelical world that I've been a part of, it is very hard to make the argument that I think you can make more easily in a Catholic congregation of a consistent life ethic, right?
Yeah.
We've just been brought up a different way.
And I will have to say, I am being discipled in that right now. I mean, one of the things you agree to as a Catholic is that the Pope is going to be, your principal teacher about how to think, how to articulate the faith. And I will admit, because of some, without going into great amount of detail, I guess personally in my heart, I feel like there are extreme circumstances in which capital punishment may be the most just thing to do. But my Pope is telling me, no, it isn't. So I have to digest that. I have to think about that. I have to pray about that. And I have to be I have to be willing to be formed by that. And I am. I'm trying to be formed by that idea. Yeah.
Well, beautiful. So I want to switch gears just a little bit and jump back to, we got to talk about that editorial, from last December.
Which editorial was that?
Like, I'm sure you feel like you wear a sign on your chest that says, "I'm the guy who wrote that editorial."
Well, here's the deal. Just an anecdote is the first article that came out about my conversion to Catholicism. The headline was, "Former editor-in-chief and Trump critic converts to Catholicism." And it's just this thing that hangs around my neck that it's got to be the Lord, because I do not want it around my neck, but there it is. Yeah.
Any regrets? Has your view changed on that in any way?
No, it hasn't changed at all. What most people who have read the editorial carefully understood that I was making a moral argument,
yes.
And I was making it to fellow evangelicals and not to the nation at large. I grant that the title, which came from a sentence in the editorial, "Trump should be removed from office," is a political comment. If I were to do it over, I might just have the title be "Trump is morally unfit for office" or something like that. But it is what it is. And if he's morally unfit for office, he should be removed from office. So
right.
The splitting hairs at that point. And I've written stuff since then. I've spoken on the topic since then. I always try to keep the topic to the issue of character and morality and how important that is for public life. I feel that's something that as an evangelical and now as a Catholic, I have something to say about that, some expertise. I keep on getting asked. I was just asked by a German magazine to write on why am I voting for Joe Biden, and why should other Christians vote for Joe Biden? And I just wrote him, so I'm not going to answer that, because my criticism of Trump is not to tell people how to vote. My criticism of Trump is that, he is a man of such deeply flawed character and morals that he needs to leave. Now, what happens, who you vote for, how he leaves, when he leaves, those are all pragmatic political questions that people have to wrestle with. But I'm not here to advocate for a particular candidate or a particular way that's happening. There are people who have a lot of political experience who know better about what to do about that. I know, who I'm going to vote for. You can be sure I'm not going to vote for Trump in November, like I didn't last time. But when we cross that line from an evaluation of character and how damaging it is to the nation to what specifically should we do next, I think there are many people out there who know better about what specifically to do next politically than I do.
I think you've just gotten right up on top of the issue that a lot of our pastors are dealing with. And that is, we have been trained, and we come out of a culture where when you have two viable candidates or more candidates running for national office, and we've been trained not to be political in endorsing one over the other, because typically neither of them is morally unfit for office, at least when they're running for office, right? We'll have to speak about afterward. At least we don't know that. And this is a different case. And it seems to me that the argument that a lot of our pastors in purple congregations are trying to wrestle with is, how do I help my congregation understand that this is not like Obama versus Romney?
Right.
Two accepted, morally upright people, right?
Yeah.
This is a different situation in this case, and that seems so very hard to grasp.
Yeah. Well, the other thing, I guess the one thing I would do differently, or I would make clear in that editorial, and I tried to make clear sense, is I don't have an argument with conservative evangelicals who, when they went to the polling booth, felt like they were caught between a rock and a hard place. They, in fact, publicly have said Trump is a man of deeply flawed character. He does happen to support Republican policies that I support, so I'm going to vote for him, and kind of with my holding my nose. That's one type of Trump supporter from the evangelical world. And I get that. I don't agree with them. I disagree with their choice, but I can respect the wrestling they went through to get there. The people I was really disturbed at, which is a fair amount of really conservative evangelicals, was they refused to criticize Trump for his character or moral problems. They actually try to talk about them in good terms. They talk about his brusque character being, well, the liberals need a kick in the butt once in a while, and Trump's going to do it for us. And then they go off and start talking about him in messianic terms. I mean, at this Evangelicals for Trump rally, one pastor was praying for Trump and thanked the Father that Trump sits at the right hand of the Father. That's language we use for Jesus, friends.
Right.
Not for the President of the United States. That's idolatry. That needs to be condemned clearly and simply. So I think a pastor can make, if he can make those distinctions, that can be helpful to people, and also be a person who says, my job as a pastor is to preach to you what I think the Word of God is telling us this week. And naturally, you need to listen to it like that. But when I step out of the pulpit, let's talk. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you're wrestling with. Tell me why you think you're going to vote the way you're going to vote. I'm interested in hearing it. I'm not going to condemn you. When I'm in the pulpit, I have a job to do. When I'm with you as a human being, as a friend, as a pastor, I got a different job to do. And if they can do that, it's amazing how they can maintain relationships in a congregation and still be able to preach prophetically when he needs to.
Well, even the preaching, I know a lot of pastor friends I talk to, they feel like the Bible has become so politicized through the last few years that if they stand up and preach Jesus proclaiming good news to the poor and release to the captive,
Oh, yeah.
that there are people in the congregation who say, well, you should stop preaching politics. And they want to say, look, these are not my words. These are from Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And someone else has made this political.
Yeah, exactly. So it is I don't know that there's an easy solution right now. Unfortunately, everything is perceived as political. And some people are even saying there's no such thing as a non-political act, which I think is true in one sense, of course, but there's also no act that's not ethical. There's no ethic that's not a product of worldview. There's no act that's not a product of morals. But the question is, what is really front and center with the person who's acting, and why are they doing or saying what they're saying? And we just have to remind ourselves that there are more important things, even as important as politics are, there are still things that are more important than politics.
Yeah. So moving to another topic, the other hot topic of the time, of course, is race. And so much of what we're running these days, opinion-wise, and even news-wise, it touches on racism. And when I'm typing in keywords for articles that we're publishing, I'm like breaking the computer typing in racism all the time.
Yeah.
It's just so prevalent in our thought. With your long perspective on this in the church, do you think we're at a moment of change, or are we just at another cul-de-sac?
Yeah, I thought we might have been at a moment of change in June, but given how the radical left has, in a sense, co-opted the Black Lives Matter movement, or not the organization, but the Black Lives Matter movement, the feeling people had that we ought to remind ourselves that blacks have been systematically oppressed and treated with unjustly, and that they still are, and that we need to do something about that. Somehow now it's perceived more and more, because of the riots and the looting, that I think it's going to be harder to get things done in a lot of ways. Part of the reason for that is we're in a kind of a catch-22, and that is one of the criticisms of the white majority over the decades has been, you constantly teach us that we should be patient and that this thing takes time. And that is true. We've used that as an excuse to push change off to the far future. But the fact of the matter is, if you want things to be more just in any given city, if you want police reform to take place, you have to elect people who are for police reform. And then they have to work with other people in legislatures and make compromises and create new laws. And you can't do that overnight. You can't do that in 3 months. You might be able to do some significant things within a year, but really significant things are going to take 4, 6, 10, 15 years. But we're at a point where people have lost patience with that. Mm-hmm. And my concern is that if they've lost patience, the fact of the matter is no change is going to take place if people are just angry and demanding immediate change, unless we revert from a democracy to a dictatorship, which most people aren't interested in. So we're kind of at a catch-22. Real change will take time, and everybody's tired of hearing that. Tired of hearing it. We have to have patience, and we have to work the system. I mean, one of my greatest, advocates of this is Barack Obama. That's what he keeps preaching. And even given my politics, I didn't vote for him. That's one of the things I really agree with him about. Yeah.
Well, interesting. So I want to jump on an entirely different topic now, and that is to talk about the state of religious journalism today. You've had a long career touching on this, and as with every aspect of journalism, this has been changed by the internet. People don't rely on print publications as much, and there's this rapid, we get stuff right now. Whereas you, like me, started off in a print world where, you put out something once a week, or every other week, or once a month, and people got that and they had time to digest it. And now it's just this, we're on
Yeah.
this wheel that never stops. And everybody out there thinks they're a blogger now,
Yeah.
and freely expresses their opinions as though they were, well-researched facts.
Yeah.
Just sort of a general opening on this is, how would you describe the state of religious journalism today? What's going on in your view?
Well, religious journalism are also caught between a rock and a hard place. That is to say, there is a constant pressure to respond, like you said, respond to what happened 5 minutes ago. I'm sure you're getting it, but we certainly got it at CT.
Yeah.
Something happened somewhere. It wasn't long before we got an email or an instant message saying, what does CT think of that? When are they going to write an editorial about that? And part of our discernment was deciding what to write about and what not to write about.
Right.
Mostly it was what not to write about. And if you don't write about it, there's always a group of people out there saying, CT doesn't care, or they disagree, or they agree with the abominable thing that happened because they're not saying anything. Well, no, that's not true. It's just that we can't speak to every abominable thing that happens and have any sense of that we're in control of our own news department. But there's a constant tension between responding to news events that happen, that's what the news is, but also kind of trying to set the agenda for what people should be talking about and should be thinking about. And you do have this, one of the things that journalists, especially today, have to keep in mind, and I do think that much of the mainstream media, not just religious journalists, have lost track of what reality is. They tend to think that what's happening on Twitter or on Facebook is what's really happening in America. And one of the most interesting things always that happens to me, like when I was editor-in-chief of CT, that was my world, that's what I was thinking about. I didn't do the Twitter thing. Fortunately, I was in a position where I just basically had subordinates who told me, this is what's happening on Twitter.
Right.
That was a great blessing. But then I would go and visit my daughter at the time when my daughter lived in New Orleans. And I would get there and nobody knew what was going on Twitter. And nobody cared what was going on Twitter. They were worried about, were they going to keep their job? Who was the new pastor and how are they going to get along with them? Oh, the grocery store down the corner closed. Where am I going to buy groceries now? Oh, my car needs a new transmission. Oh, my kids are starting junior high school. How am I going to help them with that? I need to talk to my kids about sex. They're just thinking about the world that they live in. They don't spend all their day on Twitter. And journalists think the Twitter world is real and forget that the actual world in which people are wrestling with things is actually what's really going on. And of course, the Twitter world is part of our world. It's part of the real world now.
Right.
But it gets magnified because we're all spending all our time on the computer all day long. And just to keep that perspective, okay, there's some things I need to respond to Twitter, but I also have to remember there are people who are living their lives away from all that. And my responsibility as a journalist is to help people understand what their questions are, what they're thinking about. That's why I thought that poll that we published in 2016 was so interesting. All I heard about evangelical leaders saying abortion's the issue, Supreme Court's the issue, Israel's the issue, religious freedom is the issue. And then when you poll evangelicals, the abortion was really low. It was like 4%, but 30-some% said it's the economy. It's the economy that's the most important to me.
Yeah, new poll out this week says the same thing 4 years later.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't surprise me.
So
just to keep that in mind as we're journalists would be really helpful.
I know that I experienced faith and the church, through my congregation, and through the people around me who are people of faith. And it's easy to think that all people are experiencing what I'm experiencing.
Yeah.
Right. And so any advice on how to have a broader perspective about the world of faith, to understand that it's not just what we experience on Sundays or during the week, right?
Yeah. Well, that was the lesson I took right after Trump's election, because I was mystified by the evangelical support. And whenever we would mention that, I don't think we wrote an editorial specifically about that, but in the context of an editorial, there might be a critical remark about Trump, and I would just get hammered for it by a number of our subscribers. And in order to try to understand this phenomenon, I did some reading. I read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt,
Mhm.
and other books that tried to help me understand this very conservative movement in the United States and what it was about. And the other thing I did was when someone who I felt had an intelligent critique, I might disagree with them, but at least you could tell they were well read and they were thoughtful. I would engage him and I'd say, would you mind just staying in touch with me? And as CT publishes things, just tell me what you think. And that would be really helpful. And it was actually from that base of making friends on email friends, reading a bunch about what's going on in very conservative mind, that I wrote that editorial. It wasn't like it was something that it was just off the cuff. It was something I'd actually been trying to understand this viewpoint for 3 years. And it was at that point that I thought, all right, I've done my due diligence. I do understand where this group is coming from, but to understand doesn't mean I agree. And now's the time to draw a line in the sand and say what I think the problems are. But I think we do have a resource as journalists who are very familiar with social media to become friends with people who are in a completely different world. In fact, my son-in-law's father, who's not a believer, right after Trump was elected, he found a friend in somewhere in Florida who he started to correspond with. Now, this guy's a New York liberal, and he's corresponding with a Trump advocate in Florida.
Mm.
And he just did, and he would write me once in a while and said, "This guy says this. What do you think? Does it do evangelicals work?" He really reached out and tried to understand. And we do have that facility to be able to do that now with the electronic world.
Wow, that's an excellent point. I want to move to a question that's been asked. It's a long question, but this is from a friend of ours who is a seasoned religious journalist himself, has worked on the international beat, which will be obvious in the question. He says, thanks for acknowledging the great legacy of Protestant evangelical missions in making Christianity a global faith. Lausanne really cemented this within the last 50 years, along with the movement to evangelize unreached peoples. I think we share this, he says, with John Paul II, who was a great missionary pope and saw the necessity of Catholic re-evangelization worldwide. Further, the global East and South are where the action is in Christianity today. And as imperfect as aspects of the global movement may be with heresies, prosperity preachers, ties to governments, and so forth, it is firmly evangelical and or charismatic. So this political idolatry of evangelicals bowing down to Trump or other populist demagogues is primarily a Western phenomenon, is it not?
Yes, so I could have made it clear that I was talking about American evangelicals in my critique. But you're absolutely right that in other parts of the world, there are obviously conservative evangelicals in other parts of the world who bend the knee to brutal dictatorships now and then. For some reason, there's something about in the evangelical blood that really likes authoritarianism and sometimes gets co-opted by it. That certainly happened in Guatemala in the 80s. It's happened in other South American countries. But overall, evangelicals really care about spiritual renewal, about spreading the gospel. Now, they're also involved in their communities when it comes to feeding the poor and starting orphanages and stuff. But the heart of international evangelicalism is helping people come to know Jesus Christ. I remember I had a conversation with a Catholic bishop back in the 80s, and we were talking about evangelicals converting to Catholicism, and the bishop said, well, the one thing I hope when evangelicals become Catholics that they will bring Jesus with them, because we could use more Jesus. And that was his perception of what evangelicals bring to the table. And I think he's right. And they do that splendidly overseas, more so than in the States. It's really been co-opted in the States, and it's really sad to see.
That's a wonderful perspective. Before I ask my last question, I want to remind everyone who's joining us here that you're invited to type in any other questions you have in the Q&A box, and we'll get those before we wrap up in a few minutes. But Mark, I'm wondering, now that you've been, several months, not a full year, out of the editor's chair, and are sort of just a normal citizen, uh, part of the religious faithful now, how has your perspective on anything changed? Do you see the world differently than you did a year ago?
Yeah, that could take up a whole talk, another talk. I'm still trying to process this, but it does seem like the perspective I have now is that, so I don't know how to frame this. So if I get criticized for it, I'll probably accept the criticism for what it is. It just seems like everybody is so busy running 100 miles an hour, and everybody's trying to sell something. Not just business people, but religious people. Everyone's trying to get you to follow them. Everybody's trying to get you to read their blog. Everybody's trying to get you to read their book. Uh, Everybody's trying to get you to buy their product, and they're just hustling, 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 hustling. And I've just been rereading a book by Cardinal Sarah. It's called The Power of Silence, and it's such a powerful contrast about the need for. He uses the word silence not in the sense of never talking, or although he does suggest we shut off the radio and TV more than we do. But silence is that stillness that we can have, in which we're receptive to things coming to us, mostly from the Lord, and that we're so addicted to activity and noise that it's just really hard to turn that off. And I have the privilege as a retired person to be able to say, I don't have to do any of that. I mean, I will say there have been a couple moments when I've thought, I think I'd like to do this in my spare time now that I'm free, but now that I have more time. And when I start coming at it as I would 6 months or 2 years ago. I start making plans, I start making schedules, I start having outlines, I start doing all this stuff to organize it. And I realize if I do that, I won't feel retired anymore. And I will just enter, in a sense, there's a phrase, you're old enough to remember that phrase, the rat race from the 60s. Well, someone ought to resurrect that term, because that's, as I look as a person who doesn't have to do anything any given day, that's what impresses me most. And I think that's part of the activism that is the blessing of American Christianity. Most international people understand Americans are active, can-do people, get things done, but it's also our curse. And because of our activism, I just don't think we're spending enough time in stillness and in silence, listening to the Lord before we speak. And I'll be the first to say I'm the chief of sinners in this, and I'm trying to learn how to do that.
Well, I was going to ask you to tell us about the books you have for sale, but I don't.
Exactly. Well, part of that is my personality, and that is, when you publish a book, if you've published a book, you'll know that the publishing firm will tell you, you've got to get on Twitter, you've got to get on Facebook, you've got to make this known, you've got to make sure your book is mentioned in all your things. And I think to myself, I'm not going to do that, even if it hurts my sales, because it's just not who I am. I am thankful for marketers. They do a great job at that. Let them do that. But don't expect me to do it. I'm not going to do it. So I'm happy to let people know I've written a book. I want them to read the book. But more times than not, I actually forget to mention it. And that's not a virtue. That's just who I am.
Well, that's your personality.
This is my personality. Yeah.
There are a couple of last questions that have come in, and we'll sort of head through these. And this one's a significant question. Do you see the current Supreme Court nominee as an evangelical Catholic?
Probably, yeah. Given her association with a Pentecostal charismatic movement, I haven't read that much about her, but my preliminary judgment would be, yeah, she's. I hate to say it, she's. I don't know if she would use that term to describe herself,
right?
But she seems to have a dynamic, very personal relationship with Jesus that, would characterize any evangelical or Pentecostal across the world. Yeah.
It is interesting in this moment to see Joe Biden, who's a devout Catholic on one end of this current political debate, and then you have Amy Coney Barrett, who also is a devout Catholic.
Yeah.
Basically on two ends of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
In this very moment in the spotlight.
Yeah. And the other thing that should speak to what is possible in America and the relationship of Justice Scalia and Ruth Ginsburg. Many people wrote about their friendship on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, but really, really good friends. Shared an interest in opera, shared interest in other things, bought each other birthday gifts, went out to dinner with their spouses together, and disagreed vehemently in the courtroom, and then let it alone. That to me is a model of what certainly American Christianity ought to be promoting, and American leaders ought to be promoting. It's been done. It's possible. It's not a dream.
So one of our folks online tonight has mentioned a book that I certainly would endorse along with our conversation tonight, and that's Robert P. Jones's new book, White Too Long, he's a researcher who tells the story of his upbringing in the Southern Baptist tradition, but also setting that against the overall evangelical culture and racism. And so, yes, that is a good book. I want this person to ask a question that I actually want to close with in a broader sense. And that is to ask you, for the folks who are joining us here, in this moment, just in any way that you want to address it, what are some books that you would recommend that ought to be on our bookshelves or nightstands right now?
Well, I do think Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind is really crucial. It basically helps us see the moral foundation from which people from different political perspectives are acting. So, for example, people on the right tend to value the moral value of loyalty. This comes down to the Confederate statues. Loyalty and faithfulness to our tradition and our past. Everyone would agree that's a moral virtue. Is it a moral virtue when it comes to the statutes? Well, the liberals will say no. Justice is the greatest, and fairness is the greatest moral virtue. Mm-hmm. All right, granted, that's a really important moral virtue. And he just helps us see that even when people can't articulate it, if you kind of dig down into what's really driving them, you'll find they're driven by some moral value that we can respect. Now, we still might have to disagree with them, but at least we will, disagree with them with a sense of respect, and we can actually admire one another for our principles that underlie them. Mm. The other book is, I can't remember the title offhand. It's by a woman whose last name is Hochschild. She's a University of California professor. What she did was, you could look this up online, you'd find it easily enough. It was one of the most influential books I read. She's a liberal, a Berkeley liberal, sociologist, who spent, I don't know how long, a year or two in Louisiana interviewing people in the Tea Party, just trying to understand where they're coming from, why they think what they do, and the internal contradictions that they admit they live with. It was another great book that helped me understand kind of the Tea Party way of thinking about things. Again, I don't agree with it, but it helped me appreciate how marginalized so many people on the far right feel. They feel marginalized economically, they feel marginalized morally and religiously in America now, and they're just angry about it. They're tired of being patient about it. They're as angry about that as Blacks are about injustice toward them. Mm-hmm. Again, you don't have to agree with their view or think their anger is something that should be acted upon, but we're not very good human beings, let alone good Christians, if we don't try to at least understand what these people are feeling and why they're feeling it. Good recommendations, indeed. Absolutely. Well, Mark, it's Arlie Russell Hochschild. Okay. And you'll be able to recognize the book once you Google it. Yeah.
Mark, thank you so much for your time tonight, and what a fascinating conversation this has been. We're thrilled to get to spend this time together with you, and sorry that it had to be virtual and not in person as we had first hoped.
Yeah,
But our
that would be
gratitude
nice.
to you and blessings in your new life.
Well, thank you. I was very honored that you would ask me to speak and that you'd bother to listen to what I have to say. And I hope there's something good in there for something to take away. So thank you very
You have a
much.
website if people want to look up more.
Yeah, I have my own website, markgalli.com. And I also publish something called the Galli Report. So here's my little marketing moment.
Okay, good.
It's the Galli Report. It goes out every Friday. If you go to my website, you'll find how to get a link to it. I basically find 5 or 6 articles a week. The only criteria is that they're interesting to Mark Galli. There's no other criteria. But I have about 6,000 people who follow it and seem to appreciate it. And somebody from this audience might as well.
Very good. Well, thanks to all for joining us, and we'll see you next time on our next B&G webinar. Bye, y'all.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Yeah, good.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good question.